For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for more updates.
Did you know that India, over the last 16 years ended 2021, has lifted a staggering 415 million people out of poverty? Did you know the extent of inequality in India? An average rich household spend is 25 times that of a poor household. Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I am your host Anil Padmanabhan. Last week, the Niti Aayog released the latest edition of its Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI. The MPI confirmed that 13.5 crore Indians had been lifted out of poverty in the last 5 years. It only reaffirmed the findings of the UNDP using a similar methodology, which revealed that over the 16 years ended 2021, India had lifted a staggering 415 million people out of poverty. Indeed, this is a turning point in India's rather prolonged fight against poverty. To be sure, it is not in a position to claim mission accomplished. However, it can pat itself on the back for a job well done. This, however, has a flip side. The decline in poverty is matched by corresponding growth in the middle class, bringing with it equally profound socio-economic transformations. So how does Indian public policy react to this very fundamental pivot? To understand this and more, we spoke to Himanshu. He's an assistant professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and one of the foremost development economists in the country. I began by asking Himanshu about the Niti Aayog's findings on poverty alleviation.
I think this is consistent with what we know so far. This is a fairly long period, 15, 16 years period that we're talking about. And broadly in conformity with what we have observed in the sense of a large poverty decline that happened even with the volumetric measures of the Tendulkar poverty line between 2004-05 and 2011-12. And since then, obviously, things have improved. And so therefore, one would expect the multidimensional poverty to show these numbers, drastic declines in these numbers. But I must make it very clear that these are different from the official methods of poverty calculation that the government has been using, which is the money-metric method of poverty calculation since independence. And this is not something also which is used by the World Bank or generally in other international comparisons. But this is something which UNDP has been pushing it. And this is some method which is slightly different from the normal way of measuring poverty. But certainly using this method, you do get a drastic decline of around more than 400 million people moving out of poverty using the multidimensional poverty index. So nothing surprising in that sense. And this is something which was, given the way it is constructed, the multidimensional poverty index is constructed very differently, where you have the access to electricity, access to sanitation, access to drinking water, those things coming in the picture. Those things are very different from the normal way the poverty is measured. But given the way the methodology is constructed, this is something which is likely to happen. And in fact, we have made considerable progress on those things in the last 15, 16 years. And that is something which does get reflected in the multidimensional poverty index.
So, Himanshu, you mentioned the Tendulkar panel. So, if we go back, it was probably the pivotal point where the entire definition of poverty was redefined, which added issues like access to electricity, access to education, etc. So, can you walk us through that big pivot, how it influenced the way we fight poverty and how it has, influenced the outcomes too?
See, one of the big things that the Tendulkar committee did was it included the expenditure, not on access, but on expenditure on education and health as part of the poverty line. And that was something which was further expanded when the Rangarajan committee was formed to revise the poverty line. But that's quite a different way of looking at it. That's something which is not just in terms of access, but also in terms of how much we're spending on those ones. Whereas the multidimensional poverty index is more in terms of access. and how many people are accessing a particular source, whether it is in drinking water, electricity, and various other dimensions. So conceptually, they are very different in the sense the way multidimensional poverty is designed and the way the volumetric poverty lines are designed, they're two completely different kind of measures of measuring poverty. But yes, most likely you will see that these progresses are very much accounted for in the Multidimensional Poverty Index. And that is something which is reflected in the UNDP aggregate number, which is exactly the same methodology that is followed by the Niti Aayog when it releases the state-wise numbers. The UNDP doesn't release the state-wise numbers. It basically provides some part. But the methodology remains more or less same in that sense. So yes, I mean, but that's something which is a big change that we have been looking at, that not looking at poverty only in terms of the volumetric terms, but also trying to expand the basket of goods and services that households can access. And that's something which is a progress which is happening across countries, many of the countries, and this process of revising the poverty line. Even the World Bank does a revision of the poverty line. It started with $1 poverty line, now it is $2 point something in the poverty line. So that's something which is a normal process that keeps on happening. But yes, I mean, there is no denying the fact that in terms of access to various goods and services, things have definitely improved in the last 50 years.
So that's an interesting distinction, Himanshu. You're saying that the Tendulkar panel, the way India measures poverty is on expenditure, and this is more on access. So if we take the latter definition, which is what the report we have in front of us, so we have seen now almost saturation in electricity, cooking gas, various basic necessities. Is that the reason why we are seeing such a fast decline in North India, particularly Bihar, Uttar Pradesh?
Absolutely. I mean, that's precisely the reason. And that is precisely the reason why there has been a criticism and why it has not been accepted by World Bank and various other agencies as far as the poverty measure rate. In the sense, these things will keep on expanding. In the sense, at some point of time, you'll have 100% electricity coverage. You'll have, at some point of time, 100% people having access to drinking water or sanitation coverage or other means. But that doesn't mean that people are still not poor. I mean, people will still be counted as poor because these things are something which are part of the basic necessity. And once we cover the basic necessity, then it does help them to change their lives, move up the economic ladder. There is a mobility that comes with it. But it is still a question of where incomes play an important role. I mean, for example, take the case of urban slums. I mean, this is a very famous example, which was in the middle of the 1990s that was pointed out, that even in the middle of the 1990s, the entire Dharavi had access to electricity. The entire Dharavi had access to various other things. But that didn't mean that the poverty was not there in those ones. Or, for example, most of the urban slums where people have access to cooler, access to drinking water, access to sanitation, access to electricity. But that doesn't mean that the poverty levels have disappeared, since that's not something which is there. So what we need is some kind of a combination of both these to understand poverty, which is actually a multidimensional concept. Which the multidimensional poverty doesn't have the income concept, whereas the other one has an income concept of it, but other services seem to be, in a sense, your income levels are supposed to be you are able to afford those services in that sense. What needs is to not put one against the other, but try and have a much better understanding of what exactly poverty means. So at some point of time, we will be asking these questions that what happens? I mean, what if everybody has 100% electricity coverage? What happens? Does it mean that the war against poverty is over? I don't think that we have reached that situation, or we will be able to reaching that situation. But yes, these things do help the population, help the poorer population to access better services, access better sources of income, improve their livelihood, improve their incomes. And those things are essential. Those things will continue going on. But to say that the poverty battle will be won, even if all of these provided, I don't think it's something which is a true way of looking at it.
So, Himanshu, this point that you're making is that there are two stages of the battle against poverty. So, the first phase, which is a critical phase, which had never been fixed previously, all these legacy deficits, even if you went back to 2005, the aggregate number that everyone uses is pretty high, it's 40% to 50%, depending who measures it. So, the access part is a key part of that necessary condition. Let's call it the necessary condition in fighting poverty. Now that's been fixed. So in that sense, a very key part of the battle against poverty has turned a corner, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think one doesn't have to be look at it as a sequential thing, in the sense this has to happen and only then the other can happen. I mean, both have to happen simultaneously. And that is what has been happening. I mean, since the 80s and 90s, I think access to these services have been expanding at a much faster pace. I mean, both in terms of availability of these services in most of the rural areas or in urban areas, but also the ability access to it. And both are not the same, exactly the same thing. But I think there have been a massive expansion on those issues. I mean, we are not still talking about education, health, and nutrition, which even the report will confirm to you is that our progress on these are not exactly the same. While we have managed to have a much larger access to these physical infrastructure, which is access to other things that we're talking about, but when it comes to the soft ones, which is also talking about really the ones which define a person's ability to earn a livelihood or to improve their well-being, that is where I don't think even this report says that we have made considerable progress. And that is education, health, nutrition, livelihood, gender. Those are issues which require a longer time frame.
It is clear that India has managed to bridge most of the legacy deficits that it has carried for the 7 decades since independence. Now, public policy will have to pivot from poverty alleviation to one that focuses on the improvement of livelihoods, teaching people how to fish, as it were.
That's an interesting question. And then let me clarify one thing. You see, once you have got electricity in your home, it doesn't go away. I mean, you will still have it. Once you have access to a toilet, it is an access to toilet that will continue to remain. But that doesn't mean that your incomes are going to improve in the same way. And when we are not talking about middle class, we are essentially talking about incomes. We're talking about their purchasing capacity. We're talking about people who can really buy those commodities which we call as the discretionary spending in that sense. And in fact, don't be surprised if you have a great improvement in terms of multidimensional poverty index, but not so much improvement in terms of volumetric poverty. You might have a situation where volumetric poverty which actually go down. I mean, which is that larger number of poor will be reported based on volumetric. Because you have got the electricity, might have got it in 2005, but doesn't mean that your income will not fall. I mean, if you lose your jobs, or for example, your wages don't rise, you may still be income-wise poor, even though even though in terms of multidimensional poverty, you might have actually improved. The question of middle class is more in terms of purchasing power, more in terms of incomes, more in terms of the kind of consumer behavior, which is quite distinct from the consumption behavior of the poor, which is more centered towards what we call as necessities, which is roti, kapda, makan, or basically food, which is a large part of their total consumption. Now, middle class is something which is obviously has emerged in the last 35 years, and it is something which is expanding quite a bit, although we don't have a strict definition of what exactly is a middle class. I mean, people have defined what middle class is. Obviously, government doesn't use middle class as a term in their official documents anywhere because there's no strict definition that is there. But yes, I mean, there is obviously, as countries' income is growing, our per capita incomes are growing, the middle class is going to swell. The middle class is going to increase quite substantially, and it has increased. It is something which is, I mean, I'm talking about what is the popular definition of middle class, not a very official definition of middle class, because there doesn't exist any in that sense. That is going to define your economic strategy. That is also going to define the challenges that are going to be facing. And remember, the middle class in that sense is more or less saturated in terms of the access to these services. They are more or less. So that is not the challenge. The challenge is whether the middle class can actually translate into as a driver of, which is like increase its consumption capacity to basically further drive investment in the economy, further drive consumption in the economy. And I think that is something which is where one has to be very careful about. The middle class, because of the size, is a quite a bulky one, which is we have a top, which is a very small one, and the bottom, which is the poverty one. But the middle class, again, is not a very homogeneous category. It is actually quite a heterogeneous category, and it is quite heterogeneous in terms of its location, in terms of its spending ability, in terms of its access to jobs. And I think the middle class expansion is a reality. It is going to increase, and it will, as of now, is something which is largely driving our growth story.
The good news is that India's middle class is growing. The bad news is that the middle class, which is projected to grow to a staggering 1 billion in 2047, is going to be very stratified in terms of incomes. So yes, while one challenge about poverty has been overcome, India is to now brace for a new public policy challenge, which is inequality.
Absolutely, and that is where the inequality question becomes important. I mean, I'm not looking at inequality as a moral or ethical issue that there has to be. And I think it's something which is very essential to growth. I mean, remember, we are an economy which are not a export-led economy. We are very much, 60% of our GDP is still domestic consumption, with a consumption-led economy. And the larger the consumption base, the larger the number of people who are demanding those consumption goods, the larger the upswing that is going to be as far as the growth rate is concerned, what the response of the economy is going to be. A narrow section of the people cannot be a driver of growth. I mean, that's something which is obviously going to be, because one, it extracts a large amount of resources to be able to provide for those ones who are at the bottom of the distribution. That's a political choice. I mean, we are still a democracy, and we have to do that. But at the same time, we are missing out on the market that these are the ones which are going to create. And we will do much better if we basically try and raise the incomes of these bottom a billion people, or whatever number that you can think of, to be able to take advantage of the opportunity that has been created by the economy. If we do not do that, that will lead to a problem of unemployment, that will lead to a problem of social tensions. It will lead to a problem of disenchantments and all sorts of issues, with a large claim on the government to be able to provide those services. And I think inequality in that sense is a real big threat to economic growth, and one has to be very, very careful in terms of depending only on one or two engines, not just the first one, but even the second one is not likely to be able to provide you the same kind of impetus to take it forward or to sustain those kind of growths. So I think purely from economic point of view, I think that's something, the third point that you talk about is something which is essential for furthering the growth.
In the final analysis, it is clear that India's battle against poverty has turned a corner. Lifting 415 million people out of poverty is no mean task. It's a staggering achievement and should be celebrated. Most of the legacy deficits in basics have been resolved, but new challenges are emerging. How does India address this in terms of the public policy framework will influence the ability of the middle class to realize its aspirations and the Indian economy to deliver its potential. In other words, the goalposts are being moved. But as they say, any task well begun is half done. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Strat News Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.